Hey guys, it is God's plan for you to listen to this lecture. This episode is going to be fascinating, really. It's about phonemes and allophones. Ready? Let's go. So this is something that a kid obviously wrote and has misspelled quite a few words in the prescriptive grammar that we teach. I'm going to attempt to read this. Let's see how it goes. I have 3 kids, so maybe I'll do okay. The devil and the baby ghost. A devil napped in the bright sunlight. He said, "It is Halloween. I have to get up and get ready to scare the little children," with a J. I love that. "When they go to trick or treat," CH. First, he made a jack-o'-lantern. He put 2 candles in it, no N, to really scare them. Then he made a cauldron to cast spells on the children. That's fabulous. This has everything to do with phonology. What is phonology? Well, you have spelling, and then you have pronunciation. So if we have different animals or different words, cat, cats, dog, dogs, rose, roses, kiss, kisses. So why is it that cats, it sounds like a s sound, when dogs, roses, and kisses are all using the voiced z? Why? Well, that's phonology. Psychology of speech sounds. How sounds interact with a given language, sound patterns, sound change, sound distributions, etc. So that's what we're looking at. Psychology of sound. The speech sounds that are used in languages that we speak are sorted into categories. Remember, we talked about that in the last episode, about what phonology is compared to what phonetics is. The phonetic differences are not what you look at. What you're looking at is the detailed differences that are apparent to new learners. So let's say in Spanish it's the pero and perro. Those are 2 R sounds, but one sounds totally different from the other. And it's 2 different words, so it's either pero or it's perro. And a fluent speaker may not realize that there's such a marked difference. In English, an example would be pen and spin. Pen has the aspiration after it, but spin doesn't. We don't say spin, right? That would be weird. Grammaticality and sound substitution. So if somebody is learning English or another language and wants to substitute one sound for the other because they cannot physically figure out how to move their mouth in order to make that sound, that's what we're talking about, people substituting sounds. So, kids do this a lot. For example, my daughter used to say, instead of yellow, lello, and that's a very common substitution. Now she pinches me when she sees a yellow car. She says banana. I don't know. I don't get it. So why would a native standard American English speaker never say table? They say table. You hear the table. Table. If you put your tongue right against the back of your teeth, that's where you make the t. stable sound with no aspiration. But non-natives can say that. Stable. Stable. Yeah? Well, all word initial voiceless stops are aspirated in English. It just follows the rules. It's just following the rules, and that's why it would be ungrammatical. It's not really, doesn't follow the rules of our sound system. However, there are non-standard sounds that are like variations, and they're not very far from what our sound would be. Okay, let's go on. Why does it make sense for non-standard accents to produce such, for example, if I want to say that thing, that would be in English, that thing. Some languages do not have those sounds, the interdental, where you put your tongue in between your teeth, and either it's voiced, that, or voiceless, thing, right? So some people would need to say dat ting, or zat sing. But they would never say pat bing. No, why? Because of rules and sound substitutions. So turning a the, like that, to a p doesn't make sense. Yeah? Otherwise, they would be not as similar, not substituting the actual sound that they want to make. So sounds are just letters, right? What do these words have in common? We have top, stun, fat, mitten, bottom. They all have T's in them, right? Do they have a T sound? They have nothing in common. So let's look at this. There are different phonetic realizations of the T, okay, in American English. So we have the aspirated t, top. The plain T, stone, stone, fat. It's unreleased, right? It's back there. You don't even release it. Nobody ever says fat unless they're really trying to make a point, right? Fat. It's not released. Mitten, that's a glottal stop. It stops somewhere here, especially in southern. Mitten. And bottom is almost like mitten, but it's a flapped. It's a flapped T instead of a glottal stop. So these are all different. There are hundreds of possible sounds we could use. Most languages only use very few. But there is a system, and they use the sounds that, the same sounds over and over again, right? Of these sounds that are used, very few make a big difference, okay? So what phonologists look at, is contrast. Which sounds are contrasting, which, when you use one, it means something totally different from when you use another one, okay? Remember when I talked about ice and eyes? So how can we tell if a sound contrasts? Well, if it creates a different word, a different meaning, okay? So pen versus bin. Pen versus, I don't think I can pronounce this one. Pen, I guess. Pen. That's what I usually say. Pen and bin. And then we have the vowel, which I have a hard time with. Pin and pen. So who cares? Why does it matter? Literacy in most languages depends on the psychological categories. So what categories do you have in your brain that when the sounds go together, it makes sense? Okay? Spelling does not make sense if you look closely at the phonetic level. Some people say we should use the International Phonetic Alphabet instead of the way we spell things now. Okay. So now we're going to look at phonemes and allophones. The most important concept to phonology is the phoneme. Phonology is the study of phonemes. So you have a mental category of sound, sh, e, p. So you have two e's there, but in my mind that's one sound, e, e. And this is two letters, but in my mind it's one IPA symbol, sh, right? What you think you're saying, what other people think they're hearing, and then an abstract mental unit. So a phoneme is not a sound, it's an idea. What idea do I have in my head, and what idea does the listener have, and does it mesh? Is there communication? Okay. So how do we know what's a phoneme? When two sounds contrast. So if I say sheep or cheap, those are two sounds. Sh and ch are very similar. The only difference is sh is unvoiced and ch is voiced. How do we know when they contrast? When they make new words. Sheep, cheap, right? P and B are phonemes in English because they make new words. Pin, pin, and bin. I would say ben, pen and bin. P and p are not phonemes. So if I say, again, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Let's see. Pen and pin, it sounds the same to me, are not new words. The sound's a little different according to some people, but okay. So that was phonemes. Now we have allophones. The different phonetic realizations of a phoneme are allophones. So you have one phoneme and then different ways to realize the sound of that phoneme. So, like spin, p, and pen, aspirated, are allophones of the same phoneme. The phoneme is p, right? Just for you to know, phonemes are written between these types of brackets and then allophones between these. You don't necessarily need to know that, but if you want to make a little bit of sense out of this and that helps you, then great. I think this ran over the T, but here we have t, 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 right? So when we looked at the list of all the words using T, we have in our mind, right? But there are different allophones that realize different sounds. Table, table versus table, table, right? What's in your mind versus what you actually say, okay? They have, allophones have phonemes have contrastive distributions. And they come in minimal pairs. So two words with distinct meaning that only differ by one single sound, like sheep and cheap. We have this example of time versus dime. T, d, t, voiceless, d, voiced. Pronounced, produced in the same area, right? There's another one here, thumb, and sum. So thumb, you don't even pronounce the B, that's not even really there. So It's not in your mind as what you see in your mind, what you have in your mind psychologically. Some, thumb. And for those that do not have the th sound in their language and they learn English and they're trying to say thumb, that's a hard thing to say. T and D for time and dime are phonemes. Yeah. Allophones do not contrast. It's like saying tomato or tomato. There's no difference. They're all tomatoes. I would say tomatoes. They come in complementary distribution. They do not create a difference in meaning, and they're predictable. And phonemes are unpredictable. Okay. Allophones in context, they occur in specific environments. So here we're talking about in English. There's a whole list here, okay? So we have, for example, an allophone would be lane and language. The difference here is n and ng, because the n goes into a little bit of the language. The N kind of hangs on to the G, right? So this is N right here and ng. Yeah. So just think about what makes sense. What makes sense where you're pronouncing and why somebody would pronounce one thing one way and others would pronounce it a different way. Okay? The status of a sound as phoneme or allophone is language specific. So in some languages, the p sound, aspirated, has a different meaning when used in a word, different than p. In Thai, for example. These are not allophones of the same phoneme. They're actually they produce, well, they're not allophones. In English they are. Okay. They're phonemes. All right, so let's think about it this way. You have Clark Kent and you have Superman. And what does this have to do with God's plan? I don't know. We're getting to that. So here's complementary distribution. They're never seen in the same place at the same time, like allophones aren't. You have tomato and tomato, but if somebody says tomato all the time, they're not going to just switch to tomato. And you can't use them at the same time. If I say tomato, I'm not saying tomato, right? But these two guys are Superman. Super person, right? The mental concept of supermanhood or superwomanhood or superpersonhood is a phoneme, right? Okay. So here we have Superman and Batman. Why do they say Batgirl instead of Batwoman? These are not in complementary distribution. They can both be there at the same time. They're allophones of a different phonemes, okay? Of different phonemes. The phonemes Superman, woman, personhood, and Batman, woman, personhood, right? Okay. Letters that can represent the k sound. Think about this. K as in kind, k as in cute. The CK, the CH, the CC, CCH. X, K, S, right? Q, quiche. CQ, acquire. Kazakhstan, right? K. That's crazy. There are a lot of allophones there. The phoneme, there's pretty much only one, K, right? Why are there allophones? Because we're all different people and we pronounce it differently, maybe. Allophones emerge because we do not pronounce in single segments, so we do not let's say, if I say catalyst, catalyst, I have the t, cata, which is like a, I don't remember the word for it, sorry. But you hear that it sounds different, catalyst, right? And the cat doesn't necessarily go, it's not necessarily cat a list. It all goes together. Catalyst, right? So some of the sounds, like in sing, the N goes into the G, and one sound kind of intrudes into the next sound. It's just natural speech. That's what God's plan is about, and I'm going to show you in a minute. Sample problem, English long vowels. Think about if a long vowel in English changes the meaning of a word. Okay, let's look at this. So we have pad and pat. Pad, the A is a little bit longer. Remember, this colon means elongated. Pad, pat, shorter. Hood, hoot. Just that D. Hood, hoot. Roam, roam, rope. Teeth, teeth. Because you have the, you pronounce the E a little bit longer. Teeth and th. Not voiced, right? Voiceless. That's shorter. Interesting. So one sound reflects on another and affects how the other sound is going to come out. Okay. Are there any minimal pairs? No. It's only the difference of a sound, right? Do long and short vowels occur in the same phonological environment? No. So they are in complementary distribution. So they're allophones of the same phoneme. So if you see this phoneme, a and a, the only difference you have here is the colon, which is the elongation. So it's an allophone. It's not a phoneme. This is one of my favorite parts. Phonological rules. So this is how we end up saying something that is really not how it is spelled, how it is prescriptively thought of. We have, I'm missing an I, assimilation. So unbelievable becomes unbelievable, right? Because the B is bilabial and the N is not. So your mouth tends to do unbelievable, yeah? Strength, this is for insertion, strength. Remember when I mentioned strength, when you put the K in there? Strength. I can't do it, but some people can. And hamster, you insert a P. Hamster. I'm sure you've heard that. Then you have dissimilation. Texts becomes textas, because who can say texts? Anyway, that's crazy. It's really hard. That's why people say textas. And sixth, that's extremely difficult. Sixth, okay? And then you have deletion. He handed her his hat. You start deleting H's. He handed her his hat. I hardly even pronounce a couple of the H's. Prerogative becomes prerogative, right? Because you're deleting. And governor becomes governor, right? And then we have phonological rules, and I'm going really long, I'm so sorry. Metathesis. Some people, instead of saying ask, they say ax. and metathesis is just changing the order. I'm sure you've heard that, ax. I'm going to ax her a question. And nuclear becomes nuclear. You kind of switch it around. You strengthen with aspiration, pat, top. Or you weaken with flapping, rider, and rider of a horse, right? Sounds the same to me. Okay. So here we have God's plan. Finally, we're at the end. God's plan with Drake. Let me show you. Phonetics is all theory. Phonology is reality, what actually comes out of your mouth. Now think about, I don't know if you guys have heard this song from Mr. Drake. It's a little popular now. Think about what it would sound like if I said, they are wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing. Yeah, they're wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing, right? It flows. I've been moving calm instead of I have been moving calm, right? Trying to keep it peaceful is a struggle for me. So trying to, is that a word? Could be, because you're saying, I am trying to. Yeah? You know how I like it when you love it on me? When you are loving. So all of these sounds end up collapsing. They affect each other, and you end up having different sounds coming out to stand instead of having all of the perfect sounds that phonetics would have. Yeah? Till next time. Bye.